Lance Russell is an Atlanta-based filmmaker and media communicator who, for over 3 decades, you look great for your age. 3 decades. He has been entrusted by clients to tell their stories. A seasoned producer with an innate ability to cut to the heart of the matter, Lance's instincts are tailor-made for today's media bite culture. Brief, poignant, and always entertaining, Lance's current passion is bringing Atlanta's colorful and inspiring past to life with his Rest of the Story style video series, Stories of Atlanta. History's best communicators, Lance have always been storytellers. It's in our DNA. Once upon a time is how we got to where we are now. Okay. Thank you very much, Lance. Please take it away.
Don't you think I sound much more sophisticated as Lance? You know, I love it with an accent introduce me like that. Lance. So it sounds regal. Thank you for coming out here today. I appreciate it. Those of you who are expecting a reincarnation of Franklin Garrett are going to be disappointed because I am not a historian. I'm a filmmaker, and I use that term loosely because back in my day, filmmakers were, you know, French guys who made black and white films that ran 8 hours long and it was one shot. But that seems to be the vernacular of the day. Everybody who works in video, who works in media is a filmmaker and all. And that is me. And I got to be sure I remember how to do this. And I do indeed tell the stories of Atlanta, but I don't do it by myself. Stories of Atlanta for our purposes here, we are talking about our YouTube channel, which is called Stories of Atlanta. And if you go to YouTube and just search Stories of Atlanta or type in that address, you'll come to it. We have a couple of hundred short videos on our YouTube channel, all about the history. Try not to get too serious, and we impart good knowledge, but we try to have some fun along with it. Look like you might be of an age where you remember Paul Harvey, the radio announcer, and he used to have this wonderful radio show in the afternoon called The Rest of the Story. And we kind of pattern our stories. We try to, at least, out of that. We tell you a story, and then we try to put a little twist ending at the end. So you think you're listening to a story about one thing, and it turns into another. We succeed sometimes, and sometimes we just say it like it's a twist ending when it's not really at all. When I say we, I want to acknowledge my co-producer in this project, the person whom without there would be no Stories of Atlanta. My daughter, Jennifer Russell, my co-producer, co-writer, co-creator. She does all the research. She's our social media person. I've yet to understand how Twitter and Instagram work effectively. I mean, I know how they work, but anyway. So thank you, Jennifer, for all the work you do. I want to give you a little bit of background about me because I just think, especially when we're talking about history, we'll use the phrase "consider the source." You know, where you got your information. So I'm going to start. It's a little unusual. It's not much of Atlanta history, but I'm going to start out with this fellow right here, this handsome young man. And he is the reason I got into the business that I got into. When I was 8 years old, I was on this guy's television program. He had a show in a local TV show called Mars Patrol. And he had this spaceship and kids would sit in this, the spaceship and they'd take a trip to Mars. And he would play Buck Rogers serial films. You know what I'm talking about? They leave you a cliffhanger kind of thing and all. And then he would come back and do little bits and all. And I had a job. I used to watch him on TV, and I had a chance to go sit in the studio and watch. And I was sitting there in that studio, and I'm looking around, and the set was cheesy. It wasn't a rocket ship at all. It was just 2 walls, and the windows were painted, and I was in a folding chair, and there were lights and cameras and people running all around. And I totally wanted in on that. I just thought it was the coolest thing in the world. I said, I wanted stuck with that, and I have followed that passion. And in April of 1968, I was 17 years old, and I got my first professional job with the ABC television network. That was pretty good right out of the bucket. I hadn't even graduated high school yet, and I got this job. They called it a runner, but I was just a glorified gopher, and it was very unusual for this. 17-year-old kid would not have been hired, except that in April of 1968, I was living in Memphis, Tennessee, when the whole world came to Memphis. And it was just an exciting time. It was sad, but for the people of Memphis, it was terrible. Forever tainted with, that monarchy. But it was at the same time sad, but it was the most exciting job I ever had. I had a pass to get me out, excuse me, after the curfew. I had a letter from the governor saying I had a right to be there, and I just living the dream, you know, and all. So, you know, but then they packed up and went away. But I was lucky enough to continue my work with the ABC affiliate in Memphis, Tennessee, where I live, WHBQ. And I was just a production guy, but I was living the dream. I was in the thing, and at that time, local television actually was local television. We produced local shows. You had to, you know, you were by the FCC rules, you were required to do a certain amount of public service and all. So we had all the stuff you would think. We had a monster of ceremonies who hosted a Friday night. They'd play cheesy horror films. He called himself Savad. He was actually a marketing, theater marketing guy in Memphis named Watkins Davis. And if you Savad, you'll see that it's Davis spelled backwards. So that was Savad's origin. We had a rockabilly star. This guy's named Eddie Bond, and he was one of Carl Perkins wannabe kind of guy, you know, and we taped him every day. He had a morning 15-minute program that he ran. We had tons of kids programs, including Happy Hal Miller, who owned a toy store in Memphis. He had an old house down in Midtown Memphis. And that was and how he was able to get on a TV show called Happy Hal's Toy Store, you know, and he promoted his toy thing on it. But that was his puppet Little Bo, and the big thrill of my life. I watched Little Bo and Happy Hal as a kid, and when I got this job at this ABC affiliate, I actually got to work Little Bo. I was terrible at it, but hey, man, I was Little Bo for a while, and we had an American Bandstand local wannabe thing. And as you can see, we had some credentials because the young fellow on the right was a local boy, and he agreed to come on one time and one time only. And I'm not sure that Elvis Presley ever did a local TV show like that. Again, the guy on the left with the guitar is not one of Elvis's musicians. He actually was a disc jockey in Memphis, Tennessee, a rock and roll DJ named Dewey Phillips. And he was a wild man, you know, in those early days of rock and roll. And the fellow in the middle was the host of the show. And you may be looking at that guy thinking, I've seen this guy before. Who is this guy? And he was this guy. He was the guy who set me on my path to get anything. And ultimately, he left Memphis and made quite a name for himself as Wink Martindale, the TV game show host. He had a half a dozen shows, Tic-Tac-Doe and Trivial Pursuit, and that sort of thing. So Wink left Memphis, and why would I stay there? So I came to a bigger market where I can make a name for myself, and I got a job at WAGA Television in Atlanta, Georgia. At that time, they were a CBS affiliate, Channel 5. And I worked with these guys. That's Bill Hartman, Jim Axel, Chuck Moore, and Guy Sharp. I bet some of you remember those people. Certainly Guy Sharp. He was well known in the area. I stayed with Channel 5 for another 7 years or so, and then I got out of the broadcasting business. I thought I wanted to be the general manager of a local TV station. Turns out I was not a very good manager, and I read the writing on the wall, and I got it, and I went into the production business, which I liked, and I started doing television commercials, and it turned into a 25, 30-year career of doing TV commercials and news promotions and that sort of stuff. I hooked up with CNN like everybody does in Atlanta at some point, and they liked my work. And I ended up working as a contractor for them for about a dozen years. And I just went Atlanta, Washington, New York, bang, 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 just making. It was a lot of fun. I got to meet a lot of their people and all. And I did a lot of commercials. And the reason I go through all this is this was kind of the birth of my storytelling abilities, such as they are. I just realized everything I turned it into a story just because that was my personality. And doing commercials really helped me get discipline on how to be concise and how to tell a story in a short amount of time, because back in the day, you only had, 15 seconds, 30 seconds with the usual TV commercials. So I think I've got a little sample of the kind of work I did. I'll play that for you. Is that loud enough? I like to sit on chairs and you prefer the floor. Walking with each other, think we never match it all, but we do. But I think it was very sweet of Adele to record that song for me. I appreciate it. She doesn't actually know she did that, but I'm sure she'd be okay with it. So that was some of my career as a commercial director. And you notice one constant about all of that is people. I ended up gravitating toward directing people as opposed to directing cars running down the road and, and loaves of bread and that sort of stuff. And just really, it got a very great appreciation for actors and their ability to work. And I also worked with a lot of non-professional peoples and all. And along the way, like everybody in the film business, I started watching documentaries and things because I wanted to learn. You copy people to see it. And I came across this documentary right here, inventively titled New York, a documentary film. This is a wonderful documentary. If you have any thought at all watching, I highly recommend it. Bring some popcorn and a big orange drink though, because it's 8-part series and it runs 14 and a half hours long. They start out with Henry Hudson sailing up the river that would one day bear his name, and they end towers coming down on 9/11. And I understand they're making another addition to it now to kind of catch up from where they were. The documentary was directed by Ken Burns' brother, Rick Burns. As far as I know, this is the only project like this that he ever did. He works with his brother a lot and all, but Rick Burns directed this, and it's just a wonderful documentary. When I got done with it, I knew more about the history of New York City, and I was interested because I was traveling back and forth at that day between Atlanta and New York. And so I started looking around for the Atlanta documentary. I wanted to find out about the city of Atlanta. I'd lived here. I moved here from Memphis in 1973. And I was talking to somebody earlier, you could see the Polaris Lounge on top of the Hyatt Regency, that blue bubble. You could see it from anywhere around this. And now you have to get up in the merchandise mart and look down to see it, But I could not find the quintessential Atlanta documentary. And as a filmmaker, Jennifer and I looked at each other and we said, well, maybe we should make a documentary about Atlanta. Little did we know how hard that was going to be and what kind of work you had to do to go through. We had big dreams, though. We didn't want to do just a doc. We wanted a big, epic documentary. So anyway, we started where everybody would start. I'm sure those of you who know Atlanta history are familiar with Franklin Garrett and the Atlanta and Environs book and all. And that's where we started, just digging through there. That's how we got our first taste of the history. And that led us to 75 other books and web pages and people and what have you. And it also led to the development of the stories of Atlanta. We created this little mosaic out of pictures we found, and we started telling these little short stories because we kind of wanted to share what we'd found because we thought it was cool. I was talking to someone earlier. I moved here in 73, and this was always just a big city, a place I came to make money. It could have been any city in the country. Never really felt a part of the city that much. But then we got started researching this, and I started learning about the city's history. I started learning about some of the names that are associated on the streets. And I started to develop this sense of belonging, this sense of home. And I think that's what happens when it's hard to put a price tag on something until you know about it, until you know what its real worth is and all. So I will show you the first story that we ever produced. It's called The Statue, and I'll let it stand at that. To show you the format of what we do. On Peachtree Street, there is a statue of Prince Railroad President Samuel Spencer, commissioned by his employees as a memorial. It was designed by Bacon hired sculptor Daniel Chester French to create the bronze casting of a man seated on a high-back bench, his gaze direct, a coat draped over the bench's armrest. 5 years later, Bacon and French teamed up to create another statue very much like the Spencer statue. Man seated, a steadfast gaze, a draped coat. However, the other work is found not on Peachtree Street, but on the National Mall in Washington as the centerpiece of the Lincoln Memorial. This is Lance Russell, and that is one of the stories of Atlanta. Captivated when we read this story because although they never said it, it appears that that statue is owned by the city of Atlanta. Norfolk Southern gave it to Atlanta. It appears that the city of Atlanta owns the prototype for the Lincoln. Daniel Chester French worked out a lot of his chops on that when he designed that. Fascinating thing. And here's a true Paul Harvey rest of the story kind of moment. You cannot see that statue today. It is in a warehouse in Lithonia. when they moved their headquarters from 14th Street down toward Midtown a little more, they just didn't want to deal with any blowback. So they just took the statue down and put it in a warehouse. It turns out Samuel Spencer, who was the head of the Southern Railway Company, much loved by his employees, 30,000 employees, raised the money to build that statue. Turns out when he was 18 years old, he was in the Confederate Army in a cavalry unit. And with all of the removal of Confederate statues going on in the country, I think Norfolk Southern just didn't want to deal with the possibility of protest and why. So they just took it down. Really is a great statue, and I think some kind of judgment, was, we can all agree overthrowing of the federal government is probably not a good thing for the country. But, at this point, that's a different story, I think. We won't get into the controversy of that. What I will get into is how much fun we had when we started looking at pictures. There's just thousands of pictures of Atlanta back in the day. And these are not old pictures, but you'll remember some of these, sure. The Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. Look at all that space around there. This was a real win for Atlanta when they built this and got the professional team. But you can't help but wonder if they had developed that area a little bit back in the 60s when they built that stadium, what it would have been like today. Atlanta is the only city in America to get both a professional football team and a professional baseball team in the same year. And we got the Falcons and the Braves in that same year. Ivan Allen Jr. was the mayor of Atlanta at that time. Excuse me. And there was a lot of wheeling and dealing that went on. And so Ivan Allen Jr. is famous for this statement. We built a stadium on ground we didn't own, with money we didn't have, for a baseball team we hadn't signed. And every bit of that is true. It was all speculative. And they had commitments and verbal agreements and all, but they didn't have the money. A fellow named Mills Lane, who worked for the Citizens and Southern Bank. Everybody remember CNS Bank? Mills Lane was the money guy behind all of this, and he helped Ivan Allen raise the money, and they ultimately got the Braves to come to town. We all know the story. This is roughly the same year, late 60s, early 70s. This is the downtown connector. I mentioned the Polaris Lounge. You can see it on the left over there, that blue bubble. That is a bar restaurant that sits atop the Hyatt Regency Hotel on Peachtree Street. It's really cool. You ride up this great glass elevator. It goes outside for a little bit, and then you're in the bar. And it's a rotating bar, and it was the hot spot. It was the biggest tourist attraction in Atlanta when it first opened up. People came just elevators and all. And I'll tell you why it was such a tourist attraction. A lot of people don't know this. The Hyatt Regency Hotel, designed by John Portman. I don't know if you remember it, you go in and it's this big open apron. They had greenery growing down, all the balconies. That was the first hotel in America that had an open atrium. Heretofore, everything had columns and floors and all. This was the first hotel you could actually walk in and look up, 25, 30, 40 stories, whatever it is, and see all the way to the top. And it changed the architectural style of hotels overnight. Everybody started building hotels with open aprons. It's very common now. You don't even think about it when you go see it, but Atlanta's one of the first. I got to call your attention to if you look way back in the center. Let me see if I can do this little. That is a billboard for Pepsi Cola on the downtown connector. The nerve of those Texans to come in here and put up a billboard for Pepsi in Coke country. 1950 is when they started building the road you're looking at right now, and that's what it looked like in 1950. So you can see it wasn't an eco-friendly process. They just ripped neighborhoods apart and built these places. That is Georgia Tech in the lower left-hand corner there, just to get you oriented. That is Grant Field, a part of that you see there long before it became Bobby Dodd's. Grant Field at Bobby, whatever they call it now. This building over here, I think that's the Biltmore Hotel, which at one time was just a really fancy hotel. It is at the intersection of 6th Street and West Peachtree. So this would be West Peachtree, headed to town. This, I assume, is probably Spring Street, which goes into town. West Peach, as you know, goes out of town and all. And quite an interesting process building. And I don't know if you know this or not, but there's a whole way net with downtown Atlanta, midtown Atlanta, and Buckhead to cover over these interstates. The one in downtown is called the Stitch. I forget what they call the one in Buckhead and all. But a lot of cities have been doing this, and it's been very successful. They build parks and retail space over the top of the interstate. So and I think that's going to happen in all three cases here. So in 30 or 40 years, look for a different downtown. Who remembers this? This is Atlanta's first jet age airport. This is Atlanta Airport. And this took the place of, well, nothing. It was the first big airport, but it ushered Atlanta into the jet age. When those big Astrojets began flying, Atlanta was ready for it. It did not always look like that. It started as a much smaller facility, and I just love the hangar to the right. This would have been what, maybe the late 20s, I think, is when the hangar on the right. If you look closely at the writing. The name of the guy who runs it is Beeler Blevins, and Beeler Blevins was one of those magnificent young men in their flying machines. He and friends, this was Asa Candler's race car track, actually his son's race car track. And it was only in existence for 1 year. It's a long story about that. It was very successful for 1 year. First purpose that Asa Candler wanted. But these guys, when they stopped using the race, they just came out and started landing their planes and flying there. And the next thing you know, Asa City leases the land to them, and yada yada. Next thing we know, we've got Hartsfield Airport. When Mayor Hartsfield died, Atlanta Airport became Atlanta Hartsfield Airport. And then when Eastern Airlines became the first airline to do an international flight, they traveled from Atlanta all the way to Mexico City. And that made Atlanta an international airport. So it became Atlanta Hartsfield International Airport. And you, of course, know the rest of the history there. This. Anybody know what this is? Peachtree Plaza. Yeah, it's and again, another John Portman thing. At the time it was built, I think it was the tallest hotel in the world, 70 plus stories, something like that. And they had this lagoon in the, and it stayed that way for a long time. I think ultimately it proved to be more of a problem with humidity and plants and whatever. But that was at one time inside the Peachtree. This is a great little shot I found. That's the Peachtree in the front there, the Westin Peachtree Plaza Hotel. And you can just see some of the big buildings going off in the distance there. Extra points for anybody who knows where this is. Look familiar to anybody? Good guess, but no, it's not underground. I'll give you a wider shot. This was an open-air shopping center located at the intersection of North Avenue and Piedmont. It was called Rio Shopping Center, and I really want one of those frogs. If anybody ever cares where they are. But look at this picture. All these frogs are lined up in this little pond. And if you look, they kind of spill out of the pond and they start crawling up that kind of a man-made grassy knoll. And they're all moving toward that big orb up there. I have no idea what the significance of that is, but it was so bizarre and so much fun at the same time. A few blocks away from this location is Ponce de Leon Avenue. And longtime Atlantans will recognize that red brick building on the left side there. That was the Sears building, and it was a distribution center. And there's an interesting story about this. It was 1920s, how that Sears building came there. In the 1920s, the folks in Miami, Florida were making a big push, and they were attracting all kinds of people. They were selling cheap land, beachfront property, all that kind of stuff, all these hucksters and all. And the city of Atlanta got worried that the city of Miami was going to usurp them and take away their convention business and take away, business and all. Advertising campaign called Forward Atlanta. The guy who started that campaign was the head of the Chamber of Commerce. His name was Ivan Allen Sr., the father of Ivan Allen Jr., who was the mayor when the stadium was built and all. And the campaign was very successful. It turned things around for Atlanta. And one of the finds was the Sears building built a big distribution center here. And this building stayed there forever. On the right-hand side, you can see a CVS drugstore and all. That obviously wasn't always there. There used to be a baseball field there. Spiller Field was the name of the field, and some of you longtime Atlantans may remember that. It was a serious baseball field. I forget the name of the league that it was in, but major players played there. Babe Ruth played there. As a matter of fact, they used to have a magnolia tree in right field. They, rather than cut the tree down, it's for right field, they made a rule that if you hit the ball and it landed in the tree, it was a home run. And Babe Ruth hit the ball, landed in the tree. So Babe Ruth had a home run. Jackie Robinson played at Spiller Field. And you can look in the background, you can see just another angle on the Sears building. And I just love, it's hard to see on this photo right here, but they have this sign right here, this deco sign, and it says S-E-A-R-S, Sears, which I just love that. A lot of things happened at Spiller Field, including probably the most unusual trade in baseball history. And I'm not in the stories of Atlanta, but I will also tell you, and I'll show you the story, the longest home run in the history of baseball was hit out of Spiller Field. And I'll let this video speak for itself here.
So he turned up.
Murphy out here. When it comes to he's in black, no one will remember. Next I got Spiller Field in 1954. Flying for in Nashville, where it was discovered and returned to Atlanta for Montague's autograph. All told, the ball traveled over 500 areas. The longest home run in professional baseball. There you go. The facts don't lie. Longest home run. Just a personal note on here. Bob Montague, it turns out, was married to a woman I worked with at WAGA Television. She was the secretary for the general manager, and I had no idea of her connection with the Crackers and all. This is that same building. It's just a little different angle, a little higher up. I just wanted to, it's a little fuzzy because I blew it up because I wanted to show you the orientation of where we are here, because it's important. This, as you can see, is downtown Atlanta here. You can see, the Georgia Pacific and the 191, and there's the Peachtree Plaza over there. And this may be the Bank of America at 10th Street. I think this is One Atlantic Tower at 14th Street. I think that's Coca-Cola's headquarters back in the background. And look what the people who built Ponce City Market, they mimicked the sign that was on. I just thought that was so cool. I love it when people pay homage to the past. So this is Ponce Road right here. Ponce runs all the way down over here, and somewhere right over here where this flag tip is, it joins Peachtree, and that's where the Fox Theater is and the Georgian Terrace Hotel. And across from the Georgian Terrace, the Ponce condominiums now, I guess they are. And if you've never taken a tour of that Ponce condominiums down there, you should do it next time. The Preservation Center has their Phoenix slides of it. It's the people open this old apartment in downtown, and it's so cool. And they got great views from the rooftop up. They get these big lion sculptures there. Yes, it is still there. You can actually go down to the belt line and get near that area, and you can see it standing there. They never cut it down. How crazy is that? There was a tree in a baseball field. Anyway, so I want you to imagine a few years earlier, you are standing on this railroad trestle right here, and you take this picture. And this about this picture is look how wide Ponce de Leon is. What is it? It's 6 lanes wide with a turn lane on one side and whatever those little yellow things are. Do you find a street that is 6 lanes, right? Especially in that close to downtown Atlanta? It begs the question, why is that so wide? And there is a reason. As we say at the Stories of Atlanta, there's a reason for everything. You just have to know the story. Use your imagination, and you can yellow lines that run the side might be the width of a railroad line. And you'd be very close, because what actually that was is where a trolley line was made. And your clue as to why is on the side of this car right here. It says car. The way those people are dressed in that picture, they are not workaday people. This is not getting up and going to your job on Monday morning. They're dressed in their Sunday finest. They are going for outing somewhere. They're not going to get there fast, because that is a mule-drawn trolley car right there. So they're probably traveling at 5 or 10 miles an hour if the mule is in a good mood. Why did they build a trolley line to the middle of nowhere? Literally, there was nothing out in this area. And it happens that, like so much of Atlanta, has to do with the railroads. They were expanding the airline railroad. They had to cover over a spring that they were using for water. If you think about building a rail line, you build the track, you move it down, you build the track, you move it down. all those guys working on the hot sun on a Georgia summer afternoon got to drink water, and it wasn't like they could get bottles of Crystal Springs brought in. You know, they had to find sources of water, so they sent people out to find some sources of water, and the teams they sent out found not one but two. Let me get my fancy water picture up here. But two springs of water, clean water, both from separate sources. So the railroad guys start drinking it, and they start feeling better. And then so some people came out from town, and they started feeling better, and word spread quickly of the healing waters that they had found out in the countryside there. And so Americans, being Americans and capitalists and all, they built a couple of buildings. They made a park out of it. They gave it a name, and they called it Ponce de Leon Springs. Ponce de Leon, not because Ponce de Leon came to Atlanta at some point. They called it, he just down in, where was it, St. Augustine, Florida. And so this was a fountain of youth in Atlanta, so why not call it Ponce de Leon? Ponce de Leon never came anywhere near Atlanta, so that explains, in our own charming Southern way, we pronounce it Ponce de Leon and not Ponce de Leon. That's how the springs got built. That's why the trolley line got built out to the area. And you ask, who built that trolley line? I'm glad you asked. And we'll tell you.
In 1868, railroad workers seeking new sources of fresh water discovered what would become one of Atlanta's first sensations, healing waters that emanated from two springs northeast of to attest to the good for what ails you benefits of the newfound source of water prompted Atlantans to travel to the area and have a taste for themselves. In short order, a name was given to the springs, a spa of sorts was constructed, and the area became a popular destination day trip. And that popularity attracted the attention of Richard Peters, who, along with his partner George Adair, owned the Atlanta Street Railway Company, Atlanta's first horse-drawn streetcar system. Peters and Adair obtained a right-of-way to extend their Peachtree streetcar line out to what was now being called the Ponce de Leon Springs. The right-of-way gave Peters and Adair ownership of a 30-foot strip of land.
That's that intersection at Piedmont and Peachtree, the Georgian Terrace Hotel.
Fourth Ward. And when the city decided to build a street connecting Peachtree with the newly created ward street, building one half of on each side of the streetcar line. Over time, the automobile would supersede the use of streetcars, and the Ponce Line right-of-way would be incorporated as part of the road. For future generations, that Ponce de Leon Avenue would be one of the widest of Atlanta's historic streets. This is Lance Russell, and that is one of the stories of Atlanta.
So they built a trolley line. Then they decided, after the thing started to develop, the area started to develop, they built a railroad, and rather than tear down the trolley line, they just built a road. They built a railroad. They built a road on either side of it. And then, of course, the trolleys went away. And so that's why Ponce de Leon to this day is wide. And Richard Peters looms large in the history. Have any of you ever heard of Richard? Amazing, because he is truly one of the pioneers of the city of Atlanta. He came here as an engineer with the Georgia Railroad, which was a private railroad company, which is one of three rail lines that were chartered to be built in Atlanta. And the Georgia Railroad ran from Savannah up through Augusta, over to Athens, and then across over to Atlanta. Richard Peters came to Atlanta as the superintendent of the yada yada. I don't know what it was. He also came with a fellow named Lemuel P. Grant, the other Grant in the Southern lore here, not Ulysses S. And Lemuel P. Grant is the namesake of Grant Park. And Lemuel P. Grant built the fortifications around Atlanta. He was from Maine, I think. He built the fortifications that were so formidable that Sherman just decided he would stand outside the fortifications and bomb Atlanta into submission, which is exactly what he did. Richard Peters lived in Atlanta his whole life. Once he got here, he died at the age of 79. And he remained his handsome look. He maintained his handsome looks all the way. Sheffield Hale, who's the big cheese over at the Atlanta History Center, wrote a paper once speculating that Richard Peters might have been the real-life inspiration for Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind character, Rhett Butler, because they had so much in common. They both were very wealthy. They both were not secessionists. They were not, fighting for the Southern cause, but they figured out how to make a lot of money as a result of it. Richard Peters, just like Rhett Butler, started a company that ran blockades, northern blockades. He had 7 or 8 big sailing ships, and he would try to elude the northern folks who were trying to keep the South from exporting its goods and make much that his impression is left on Atlanta. He started the first flour mill in Atlanta, and in order to fuel the that did whatever they did in flour mills. He bought 400 acres of pine forest land that turned out to be Midtown Atlanta all the way up through Georgia Tech and all. And he bought it for $5 an acre. And in his day, he was able to sell it for $1,000 to $1,500 an acre. He became fabulously wealthy on there. And what's the Ivy Hall? Right? Is that it? Ivy Hall on Ponce. Ponce was his son's house. It used to be called the Mansion. It was a restaurant in Atlanta, and now it's part of Duet. Yeah, and it's part of SCAD right now. So let me orient you just a little bit here, because this is kind of an interesting thing here. This is a map of Atlanta in 19. How are we doing on time? Are we? 41. Okay, I'll talk fast. This is Atlanta in 1953, and that red, I better do the pointer thing here. This thing right here, that's Union Station. That's what they called the car. That is where the 0 milepost was, and I'm sure many of you have heard of that. That was a 0 point for the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which is this railroad. This railroad ran from this point right here up to what is now Chattanooga. It was Ross's Landing when they built it, but it became Chattanooga, and that became the center of the city. If Atlanta was the universe, this is where the Big Bang happened right there. That started everything. Now, there's a whole lot of drama about that. It actually didn't used to be here. It used to be over here, and that's why this railroad track goes like this. Long story, I won't go into boring with you. But just to get you oriented a little further, I'm going to take away this is the core of Atlanta back then, and it is today still. You can see the 3 railroad tracks that come in. You have the Macon and Western, the Georgia on the right, and the Western Atlantic. And these 4 streets right here, you've heard this, I'm sure, a lot. Atlanta's streets are Indian trails paved over. Well, of course they are. Well, Indians are not going to walk on the bad spots. They're going to pick the best spots, the high ground and all. So anyway, this was once the Peachtree Trail. It ran up to where the Chattahoochee River and Peachtree Creek joined. There was a big trading post there called the Standing Peachtree. And this ran from there. You may have heard of the Sandtown Trail. Decatur Street was one. Sandtown Trail ran out to Stone Mountain. But apparently Sandtown was something different than what we would think it was, because this was also the Sandtown Trail. It ran over into Alabama. This is Whitehall Street, and today it's Peachtree Street. The business people along Whitehall Street, which used to be the business center of Atlanta. It was retail on the Whitehall Street. It was residences on Peachtree Street. Now, once Peachtree Street turned over and became a retail place, a business place, everybody wanted the imprimatur of the name Peachtree. So they actually changed Whitehall Street to Peachtree Street. You got to go 2, 3, 4, 5 miles out on Peachtree before you get to Whitehall again, out near the West End and all. And these are the streets that make up what we know as 5 points. And I want to call your attention to this right here. This is not a mistake. And you see, this is Marietta Street that goes up to the city of Marietta. The way it worked initially in Marthasville is this was the road to Decatur. This was the road to Marietta, and they were just little wagon wheel tracks. They met at this point where these trails met and all. But this I always found interesting. That's Marietta Street, but it's much wider there than it is anywhere else. And you have to wonder, why is Marietta Street so wide there? And it's kind of a fun story. It has to do with one of these 3 people. This is a treasured picture that we have of Atlanta. These are 3 pioneers who built Atlanta. This guy, you may recognize the name. He was the partner of Richard Peters, who started the Atlanta Street Railway Company, the first operating trolley line in Atlanta. And it was a branch of that line that went out to Ponce de Leon. This fellow on this side was one of the first people to ever come to this area. He came here long before there was anything. John Thrasher. They called him Cousin John because he was said to have never turned anybody away who came asking him for money and all. And Cousin John Thrasher looms large. He actually got so mad when they changed the location of the 0 mile post and moved it in that he left Atlanta. He had invested in property right around that area, sold it at a loss and left. And I think Forbes magazine, like 20 years later, estimated he walked away from something like 55 million. Money. And this guy is fascinating. This is George Washington Collier. He was one of 9 children. He moved here with his family in the early 1820s. They lived in the Peachtree Creek area, somewhere near the Peachtree Battle area over there, if you know that area. Wash Collier ultimately moved into town. His house still exists today, and we met the man who lives in it recently. And he was the first postmaster, among other things, of Marthasville. And he bought, like everybody in that day, he was able to buy real estate because it was cheap, and why not? And he ended up with over almost 700 acres of land that everybody else was selling their land and cashing in. He didn't sell any of it and did not develop it. And there was this huge going up Peachtree Street that was just undeveloped, tied up in the courts for many years. His heirs finally got his now. The last to go was where they shot this picture. This is in Sherwood Forest, which is over where WSB Television's offices are located. I was going down this road to tell you why Marietta Street is as wide as it is, and it all has to do with Wash Collier's job. So I will tell you the story of the postmaster and the judge, and then we'll wrap it up here. Oops. There.
This picture might look familiar to you. It features 3 Atlanta pioneers. The gentleman in the middle is George Washington Collier. At the age of 32, Wash Collier became the postmaster of the city of Marthasville. Duties he carried out from his grocery store at the corner of Decatur and Peachtree Streets, roughly the present-day location of the Olympia building.
Paid $130 for that.
In Collier's day, there was no free postal delivery. To find out if you had mail, you had to go to Collier's store and stand out back with everyone else where there was a porch. When Collier had finished the day's sorting, he would step out onto the porch and call the names of those system, and it worked for just about everyone. Everyone, that is, except for Judge Reuben Cohn. Judge Cohn had moved from Decatur to Marthasville and built himself a home between what is now Forsyth and Cohn Street. Reuben Cohn was a wealthy man. In fact, he owned pretty much all of the land between his house and Wash Collier's store, including Marietta Street. Legend has it that Reuben Cohn, not wishing to schlep down the street and stand in line with everyone else, had reached an agreement with Collier. Cohn would stand out on his veranda, and if he had mail, Collier signaled him. It was a pretty good system, except for one small detail. Reuben Cohn could not see Wash Collier's store because there were too many trees in the way. But given that he owned the land, Cohn's solution to the line of sight problem was a pretty simple one. He just cut down all of the trees and widened Marietta Street. Problem solved. Which explains why Marietta Street today between 5 Points and Cohn Street is really wide, boulevard wide, all because Reuben Cohn wanted to know if he had any mail. This is Lance Russell, and that is one of the stories of Atlanta.
That's one of those stories that may or may not be true. It makes for a great story, and we appreciate Reuben Cohn for this thing. I guess we're about out of time at this point. Do I? Okay. Well, let me just play a couple. What I did here is I just left a couple other things to play here. Let me see if I can. Oops. Okay. So comedians. I love the whole comedian thing here. So this is a story. I don't know if you know the intersection of Peachtree Street and Andrew Young International Boulevard. It used to be called Kane Street because it was named after the son-in-law of the guy who owned the land. His name was Hardy Ivy. You may have been downtown and seen Hardy Ivy Park. This is one of those weird things. Hardy Ivy gets the credit for being, this is so qualified, the first European settler who permanently settled within what became the city limits of Atlanta. So he gets the credit for being the first person to settle. Now, obviously, there were people living there long before. There's a Hardy Abbey Park downtown and what have you. And in that intersection of Peachtree and Kane / Andrea, right now is where the Peachtree Plaza Hotel used to be. But before the Peachtree Plaza Hotel was there, the Henry Grady Hotel was there. And it was famous, I guess I should say emphasis. A lot of fun was had in the Henry Grady by politicians and working gals in the city. And this is a story about some people who worked at the Henry Grady Hotel for a brief while.
History, there have been a number of comedy duos: Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Martin and Lewis, and Eric and Van. Eric was Phil Erickson, who toured with his disc jockey partner Van as the comedy mime act, the Merry Mutes. Settled down in Atlanta, where frequently they could be found playing the Atlanta's Henry Grady Hotel. In the mid-1950s, they went their separate ways, with Eric and his wife Nancy opening Atlanta's first cabaret theater, the Wits End. Van decided to take a shot at the big time and moved to New York City, where he became the multifaceted entertainer we know today as Dick Van Dyke. This is Lance Russell, and that is one of the stories of Atlanta.
I just love that story for you old timers. Dick Van Dyke lived in Atlanta. He may have actually been on television for a while on one of the stations here, and I just it's a great little story. Does anybody remember the Wits End Players? Yeah, they were big for back in the 70s, I think. This is a story I love here because a lot of people don't know that the famed football coach John Heisman had his career here in Atlanta. He coached for Georgia Tech, and this is a story about John Heisman and why other coaches should thank him.
His name was John William Heisman, and if you don't recognize that name, you clearly are not even a casual observer. John Heisman is a legend in gridiron folklore. From 1904 to 1919, Heisman was the coach for Georgia Tech, and every college football coach that followed owes John Heisman a debt of gratitude. Not because he fought to legalize the forward pass, not because he developed the center snap, or even because he pioneered the pulling guard. The debt is owed because John Heisman became the first college football coach ever to get paid to coach football.
How about that?
This is Lance Russell, and that is one of the stories of Atlanta.
Coaches didn't get paid, and he was so good he was able to wrangle some pay, and from that day forward, all coaches started getting money. So thank you, John Heisman. Play for you the most watched video that we had. Make this video with the intent of watch, but we titled it with the intent. This is the title on the thumbnail, but on the title it read our first R-rated video. And immediately it shot to the #1 spot and has not relinquished that point since then. And you'll see why.
Candler Building, with its ornate carvings, is one of downtown Atlanta's oldest and most treasured buildings. There are entrances on the east and west sides, and the carvings over those entrances are identical, almost. When the Candler Building was constructed in 1906, one of its neighbors to the east was a girls' school, and the clear view of those ornate carvings over the east side of the building became a point of contention for the school's headmistress. Not suitable, she thought, for the impressionable minds of young girls, and she demanded a change, which is why today the Candler Building's east side is a more modest version of its west side. This is Lance Russell, and that is one of the stories.
Made them tear down those terracotta things and redo them. It's a great story. The Candler Building is now the Candler Hotel, part of the Curio line of Hilton. Yeah. If you haven't been in there, it's really nice. If you've not been in the Kenner building at all, it's unbelievable. The carvings in there, the just historical carvings that go up the stairway all out of marble. I am told, I haven't confirmed this myself, but I am told that the elevator shafts, the shafts where the elevator went, are lined in brass, each one of them. You know, they put a lot of money into that building. And since we are in the tawdry world of R-rated videos, I thought this was a fun story, and I wanted to play this for you too.
It was called the Tenderloin. In Chicago, the Levee, and in New Orleans, it was Storyville. We don't know what name Atlantans gave to that area of our city where the oldest profession could reliably be found. But in 1912, Atlanta Chief of Police James Litchfield Beavers mounted a campaign to rid Atlanta of its known houses of ill repute. He was successful to a point. That point ended in 1915 when disgruntled members of Atlanta's business community had the chief removed from office. They said, you can't make it unpopular. This is Lance Russell, and that is
There are limits to what the law can do, apparently. You know, the rest of the story of that is that Chief Beavers was rehired not once but twice. He had a long career as chief of police, and Herbert Jenkins, who had a long career as the chief of police in the city of Atlanta, took over after Chief Beavers. 5 minutes, buddy? Okay, one more story. I'll do one more story, and then I'll show you a little poem. I love this story. Again, this person fought for the Confederate Army, so, you know, take that into consideration, but I think this is a great little story.
This is a picture of Columbus Washington Moats taken during his days as a first lieutenant during the Civil War. After the war, Moats moved to Atlanta, where he established a photography business. And over the next 40 years, C.W. Moats created an irreplaceable collection of images, pictures of Atlantans at the end of the 19th century. The motivation for visiting Moats' studio for many may have come from the catchy slogan that he used to advertise his photography services. Delay not, but go to C.W. Moats and secure the shadow ere the substance fade. In other words, hurry up and get your picture taken before you die. This is Lance.
It's persuasive, I think.
One of the stories of Atlanta.
All right, I'm going to close. I'm going to fast forward just to this, because I just want to give you a little taste. You go to Stories of Atlanta, you can find other stories. These are some of them. Same cast, same location, like it's going to change. So those are some stories you can look at when you get a chance. Thank you guys for coming out here today. I appreciate it. It's fun.
Before we take any questions, because it's nearly 1 o'clock, so if anyone needs to leave, I can understand that you need to leave. So first, thank you very much for your presentation. I found that thoroughly enjoyable, and I think I now know what I'm going to be binging on YouTube. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to give you.
Oh, excellent.
So now you can start scoping for more pictures for your next story.
It's nice of you. Unexpected. I appreciate it.
You can find Vanishing Georgia photographs on our virtual vault if you haven't gone to it yet. Our next Lunch and Learn is the Center for Puppetry Arts, Kelsey Fritz, on Friday, May 12th. Museum and Guest Services Director Kelsey Fritz will discuss the history of the museum's collection, its archives, and the unique conservation concerns around working with performance-related objects. And our current exhibit downstairs is on Georgia's historic disasters and disaster planning, and this will remain open until June 28th. So please have a look at that, and I would like to open it for questions if anyone has questions for Lance.
Yes. Okay. Wow.
Never heard that story before about the sculpture.
Yeah. 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 It's a fun building, that big.
Like if there was a restroom on every floor, and then two restrooms in the building.
Different times, I guess. I don't know. Wow. It's funny, that building, I don't know if you look at it from the back, it has two wings that go out. And from the back, there are these two big iron structures that look like they hold those wings together and support everything. And I was talking to somebody who knew about the architectural history, and they do nothing. They are only there to reassure a nervous public that they're not going to fall down. When they built the buildings, people, it was new to everybody, big buildings like that, you know, so they put these fake beams across there, two of them, so it looked good. Yes, ma'am. You know what happens with those? They cover them up. They put them in culverts. You know, there are springs all over the city that they've just put into culverts that they route down to probably the Chattahoochee or something like that. Yeah, yeah, it does narrow at some point. You're absolutely right. Yeah, yeah.
And come across these stories.
Oh, we find something that's cool and we just make a story out of it. You know, it really, we do the story part. It's all history, you know, we just try to tell it in a way, but we do a lot of research. We went from no books on the city to, literally, we probably have 100 books on the city of Atlanta right now, and just beaucoup bookmarks on browsers and everything, stuff we find. There's no shortage of stuff out there. The problem is trying to cull through it all and then trying to determine what's true and what's not true. So we have a branch of stories. It could be true. You decide, you know. Yes, sir. Right. Mm-hmm.
They could get the airbags, but the building right behind, they signed off on it, said, village, put whatever you want, but other people didn't want anything.
No
So,
kidding. Oh, that's a story of Atlanta. I'm going to have to look into that. That is great. Wow. Must be frustrating. You build a building, you have a vision for it and all, and then some citizen wants to have some other idea.
You find that you are going to use, or is it just for a certain period of time?
Oh, that's a great question. You know why you don't see a lot of stuff about the mid 20th century that paid to go there? We have a lot of research, and we actually this year we decided we're gonna delve into that. There are so many people who are still alive and who were a part of all the events that happened. And I, you know, the one thing I don't want to do is get it wrong, you know. So I've been asking folks, and I'm starting to set up interviews with people that I can just go talk, tell me about this. I've read everything I could so far about that era between, you know, 1950 and all, and yeah, look for that in the coming months here. We're gonna delve into the nervous part of telling history.
You can find these stories on YouTube.
Absolutely. If you go to YouTube and in their search box, write Stories of Atlanta. And I should have printed out a thing for it. Our logo is the Polaris Lounge, that blue bubble. Was on here somewhere. Anyway, you'll see it. It's just a little circular thing, and you click that, and that'll take you to Stories of Atlanta. I should say that we also, I don't know if any of you read Maria's supporter report newsletter that comes out every week. We're a contributor to Maria's site, so you can see every week we run one of our stories on her site. She has them libraried somewhere, but it's a little hard in her site to find out where they are. But yeah, you can go to YouTube and watch to your heart's content for at least a couple of 100 videos there. You know? Yes, sir. No, I don't. Well, that's not entirely true. We started this because we were interested in the history. We just started learning. We wanted to make a documentary, and we got a fairly far along that process. We ran into some, I guess the right phrase would be, we ran into some political considerations, people who had some ideas about birth and that sort of stuff and all. We had all this information. So that's how we started doing these stories. But it has gotten us into other areas. For example, the Georgia Research Alliance. I bet none of you have heard of the GRA, the Georgia Research Alliance. They hired us to make some videos for them. Their mission is to bring research scientists to the state of Georgia. They help them get set up. They establish labs for them. They help them, once they develop a product, they help them market that product and produce it and bring it to. It's a great thing. Had no idea that existed, had no idea those people. And we've run across several agencies like that. Actually, it was these stories that got me hired at the Atlanta Regional Commission, where I recently left. I was there for 6 years producing videos for them and all. We would like to turn this into a profit-making venture at some point, but it's not our primary priority. Yes, Rebecca, our man back in the back. It says youtube.com/stories of Atlanta, all one word. And yeah, we are. And this is probably my bad. I probably should be more careful about the stories I include in here. We have several stories about the Black community and how it developed in Atlanta. And we're very sensitive to that, probably not as sensitive as evidenced by what I showed here today, but I'll look at one of my favorites. I don't know if you know this, is how Spelman College got its name. Do you guys know how that came about? The women who started Spelman, they went to John D. Rockefeller, and then they wanted to name something after him, and so they named it after his wife. Her name is Spelman. Yeah. Somebody else had their hand up. I can't speak to that. I don't know. It may. Yeah. Well, thank you.
I think it's interesting is how you, for researching the history of Atlanta, and then
Absolutely. I was talking earlier about that. I never felt like I belonged. It's just a big city. I didn't even know how you get involved in a city that. And once I lived here, when I started, I realized it's not that hard to get involved at all. There are plenty of what's happening in Atlanta. But yeah, once I started learning about the city, it's like, oh, well, I know why that's there. I know where this goes, and it just, I don't know. It's just, I can't describe it. It just feels like home. I am, yeah. Right. And she does like bicycle tours, doesn't she? So yeah, I am. We're jealous. We didn't have the energy to do it. So we may now. Yes, sir. There you go.
Story, definitely. And that's a good place to start. It is. And lots of wonderful historical stories about the residents.
Yeah, absolutely. Oakland, if you don't go to Oakland, you really need to go out and just walk around. There's so many interesting things out there, and so many, as you said, so many great stories and all. And I apologize for the lack of diversity here. I will be much more attuned to that, to be honest with you. I told you earlier, I kind of threw my whole day and started over and finished late last night, and I probably was not paying attention like I should have. I'll be more attuned to that in the future. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Associates over in Stone Mountain, Georgia, is an archaeological firm, and every year they function there to promote and educate people and children, particularly children, regards to heritage, history, and the studies of archaeology. And you can find that usually on the internet or Google it under either New South Associates. It's very educational. They also have events for like, I think it's pottery making for the children, to show them how to make pots like their parents used to make, and then also weaving, how to make their own baskets. And
what kind of company are they? What did you say they were?
New South Associates, a contract archaeological firm in Stone Mountain.
Oh, okay.
Good.
Good.
Mary Beth Reed is the owner, but she does this every year there, and it's a one-day event there that on the internet. It's a very good.
Good, yeah.
Who like to get involved in, learning about practicing or doing archaeology. They can get invited to certain excavations.
What is it? Does their company advise companies who are building structures and stuff like that about the area they're building stuff? I mean, how do they apply their knowledge to business? What is?
Yeah, it's fascinating in regards to that because they're so interested in two things. They're one that, first of all, the people that go there, they're learning from historical to prehistoric, our humanity, and especially here in Georgia, there's so much that the average person doesn't realize or know.
Yeah.
Just to give you an example, those of us who walk around and find an arrowhead on the ground, there's always a story there. There's always a huge story that goes along with that one little arrowhead. Because usually sometimes in these areas, you'll find, particularly since farming was done all over just outside of Atlanta, in Atlanta at one time, is that there's sites that are all over near Emory University. There's lots of prehistoric, when we do the historical stuff that's documented, but there are so many stories out there that over time, there's certain archaeologists that have worked on sites where they actually have their own story of the villages, the native villages that were there for thousands of years. And you mentioned something earlier that I thought is perfect. And what it was about how the real estate, the prime real estate, you mentioned about the roads and so on like that, taking the highland, taking the prime property.
Right.
Well, the natives did the same thing.
Yeah.
When we excavated here in Atlanta over the years, we find these properties, and as you keep going layer after layer, the peeling of the onion is that you're going down, and through each layer, you're finding the different types of pottery, and you're actually finding how the industry has changed, even with the native peoples here in Georgia.
Wow.
Also, I don't know if everyone's aware of this, but Soapstone Ridge right here in Atlanta is actually Georgia's first industry. It's actually an industry that was created by the natives there. They were actually mining soapstone and carving them out of the rocks to make bowls. And they use those bowls to trade and of course their daily life.
Yeah.
They didn't have the Pyrex and the
yeah, unfortunately.
Did the two of you got together and came up with some more, information to share with the group. Because he's working on this particular thing right now, so we kind of finished that up. So it would be a good idea, maybe the two of you all kind of got together and talked about it.
Excellent matchmaking skills you have back there. I appreciate that. That's a good lead. Thank you for that. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
If the good Lord willing and the creeks don't rise. The creeks are the. After that field thought a creek was a little. And sometimes in the little country town I come from, the place called Meadowville and Calvin County, everything is better than that. I thought the creek was the wall rising up, and sometimes it run down in the day. Came to Atlanta, Georgia, and I spoke to a guy from here. And I said, something about the good Lord willing and the creeks don't run. He said, you probably think creek is a river, don't you? I mean, yeah, that's what it is. That it was the creek and.
That's interesting. I never put that together. Wow. Right.
The creek.
As I understand it, the creek was a name that white people assigned to the tribe. Was actually the Muskogee Indians, I think, was the name of their tribe. But they named them Creekings because they were people who lived by a creek. Duh. You know, where's everybody going to go? You know, we all want water. Anyway, anybody else? Thank you so much for coming out here. I appreciate it. Yes.